Did you know that you can be modest and beautiful? And did you know that modesty doesn't only have to do with what is external, but internal? And that modesty doesn't only have to do with clothes either. Then what even is modesty? If you want to find out, keep watching this video. Hi everyone, it's Jen
and Elisa
from Redeemer's Grace Church, and we're back with another video from our True Beauty series.
We've been going over at Captivated by Him, True Beauty, and how God is the source and standard of beauty, which means that God defines what beauty is. So as Christian women who are pursuing true beauty, we also want to be characterized by this. So we look to how we can imitate the likeness of Christ in our own character. That's so different from what the world tells us, that true beauty is about physical appearances or whatever you put on. But no, we can think about how we can adorn Christ in our character and in our heart attitudes. And that can be what is precious in the sight of God as we strive towards true beauty.
Right, so today we're talking about modesty and beauty, and that's not only what is on the external, as a lot of people often think, but it starts with the internal. It is a matching of the internal with the external. So in our internal, if we are pursuing to be like Christ in our character, then those characteristics should also show on the outside. And so we've been talking about things like fearing the Lord, or having a gentle and quiet spirit, being content, having truthful speech, and all of those things should be showing on the outside and not just on the inside. So in the morning when we're getting ready for our day, we can be getting ready thinking about those things, how we're going to glorify God, not just on our inside, but on our outside as well.
This is seen in passages like 1 Timothy 2, 9-10. So I'm going to read from there. And it says, "Likewise, I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing, modestly and discreetly, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly garments, but rather by means of good works, as is proper for women making a claim to godliness."
Right, and we want to key in on some of the key words here, and the first one is adornment, and this speaks to the why of modesty. So why should we be modest in the first place? And simply put, it's because God cares. God cares how we dress, and therefore we should as well. A lot of people might think that being modest is just if we layer a bunch of stacks of clothes on ourselves, but that's not necessarily modest if we're just doing so carelessly. In fact, that can draw attention away from God and even be distracting if we look really weird and just stacked with clothes. But really, we should be thoughtful about the way that we dress, not to glorify ourselves, but to point back to God. And so why should we care about how we dress? Because God does.
Yeah, secondly, the second set of words we want to key in on from this passage is braided and gold. And this is going to deal with the what of modesty. What is modesty? So in the Greek, it means reverent shame, which sounds pretty severe, but another way of looking at it is humility or a lack of vanity. So we want to have a low and humble view of ourselves in light of who God is. We want to have a high view of God and a low view of self, which we've actually talked about in one of our previous videos. But having that heart disposition is what is going to characterize us as we dress modestly. So instead of thinking about ourselves highly, we can think about ourselves properly in light of who God is as a sinner. And then we can think about how we don't draw attention to ourselves, but how we can draw attention to God in our dress. So it's not about looking frumpy and awkward or trying to have a really low self-esteem. No, it's about having a biblical esteem of ourselves, and that can be shown in how we dress. Think about Kate Middleton, for example, who's now the Duchess of Cambridge, or even some of the first ladies of our country, the United States. All of them dress to represent their country. They make sure that they're professionally dressed so that they don't misrepresent their nation. And similarly for us, we are daughters of the King. We belong to God, and God has saved us. And if we are daughters of the King of Kings, then we should dress appropriately as well. Not for the sake of ourselves, but in reverent shame, knowing who God is and who the God we serve is.
Yeah, so we're actually dressing to represent him. And I've always wanted to dress like a princess, and now I feel like I can in a modern way. But going back to 1 Timothy 2:9, it doesn't just stop at modesty, but it says that we should dress discreetly. And another way to say this is with self-control. So why do we need to dress with self-control? You're certainly going to need self-control not to hit this like button a million times today after this video, or to hit our subscribe button way too many times, but you only need to hit once in order to like the video and subscribe if you want to see more content. But in all seriousness, going back to the topic of modesty, you need self-control because our selfish inclination is to dress for ourselves. So we want to magnify ourselves, and sometimes we want to dress vainly or flatter ourselves, or even dress lazily sometimes, not really considering that God cares about how we dress. And so we're going to need self-control in order to dress for God and not for ourselves, and point it all back to Christ.
And before we move on, we want to look again at this passage and how Paul phrased it, right? Because he didn't say women to adorn themselves with proper clothing. Skirts below the knee and turtleneck sweaters, no skin showing. That's not what he wrote, right? It says to adorn themselves with proper clothing, modestly and discreetly. So he cares about the inner heart attitudes by which we dress and adorn ourselves. So earlier we were saying that the world's view of beauty is about external appearances and physical outward things. And that's not true, but we want to think about those things in light of a modest and discreet heart. And in so doing, we can please God as we put clothes on in the morning.
The last word that we want to key in on is godliness, and that really speaks to the how of modesty. So this talks about, like, for unbelievers, even they can dress in a seemingly modest way on the external, but that doesn't truly reflect what's on the inside.
It's true. Even in college, for me, I had a roommate who was really nice, but she was also not a Christian, and she actually dressed more modestly than I did as a new believer. In the first couple years when I was saved, I had a hard time understanding what it looked like to dress modestly, and even my roommate dressed more modestly than I did, even though she didn't know Christ.
Yeah, for sure. So it does go to show that modesty is not like a bullet point checklist that you can just be like, well, check, I wore enough clothes, therefore I am modest. Because it doesn't reflect what's truly on the inside. It doesn't matter if you seem to dress modestly if you don't actually have a changed internal character, and that's how it is for unbelievers who dress modestly. They may look like they're dressing in like a modest way, but on the inside they're not actually changed by Christ. So what matters first and foremost is that we are modest on the internal, and then that shows on the external.
Right, so again, the external must match the internal. So as Christian women, we are called to adorn ourselves in good works. That's what it says in this verse. And one of those things is by modest dress. And in so doing, we can think about how our dress and how we put on clothes isn't going to distract or take away from our godliness or take away from what is going on inside of our hearts, but instead how we dress ourselves can add to and enhance the godliness that we have internally. And that is precious in the sight of God.
Yeah, and so just to go over the practical aspects of modesty, since we've been talking a lot about the internal, which is the important part, it has to start with internal. But practically, we know that different women have different body types. So what might be modest on me might not be the same on Elisa or some other woman. And similarly, culturally, we know that modesty can be different as well. But it does all come down to the crux of it is objectively, modesty does start with the internal, as it tells us in the Word, when we humbly come before the Lord and we want to glorify Him and not ourselves by the way we dress.
So as Jen was saying, there is a subjective aspect, but we are focusing on the objective aspect, that the external starts with the internal. The external matches the internal, but it comes from the internal reality of knowing Christ. So when you are putting on clothes tomorrow morning, you can think about this as you're shifting through your wardrobe. You're like, what am I going to put on? You can think about how you can glorify God in that moment and be truly beautiful and adorn yourself externally of what is already true inside. So I hope that this video was helpful for you, especially for tomorrow morning when you are getting ready. But as we continue in this series, Journey with Us, and we are excited to see where it takes us to continue to grow in our own beauty in the Lord. So until the next video,
Stay captivated.
Okay, I'm sure we got something.
Oh no, you are filming.